Today, Chris Jericho is one of pro wrestling's most enduring and evolutionary performers. He enjoyed an 18-year on and off tenure with the world's largest wrestling company, where he wore many character hats and held numerous coveted championships. Such was Jericho's prestige as a foundational star, an enterprising young promoter even built a new organization around the late 40s version of him to undeniable success. Y2J, the best in the world, Le Champion, no matter what the label, Jericho has been an omnipresent and relevant headline star across multiple decades. By any measure, Chris Jericho is a first ballot inductee into any pro wrestling Hall of Fame. All that being said, it's weird to imagine a point in Jericho's career where he bashed his head against a criminally low depth chart ceiling. But that's precisely what happened when the Winnipeg native was working for a now defunct American powerhouse. And just before the turn of the millennium, the would-be Millennium Man decided to make a career-altering jump. I'm Jack from Cultaholic Wrestling, and this is the true story of when Chris Jericho left WCW. In 1996, 25-year-old Chris Jericho made his debut for a surging World Championship Wrestling. He was a few months shy of achieving 6 full years in the wrestling business at the time, but he'd already had worlds of experience to his name. After breaking into the business with fellow Canadian Lance Storm in 1990, Jericho quickly assembled an impressive international profile. He wrestled in organizations like Japan's FMW, Mexico's CMLL, Jim Cornette's Smoky Mountain, and later Japan's WAR promotion, before turning up in Paul Heyman's ECW at the dawn of 1996. Though he only wrestled in ECW for about 7 months, Jericho enjoyed notable matches with Taz, Cactus Jack, Rob Van Dam, and Sabu, and even held the television title for 3 weeks. After putting over Too Cold Scorpio at the ECW arena that August, Jericho hopped onto the same elevator that a number of his peers had recently ridden. Over the previous year alone, internationally seasoned talents like Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, Rey Mysterio Jr., Psychosis, and Conan had all jumped to the ever-expanding WCW. Now it was Jericho's turn to follow that same yellow brick road into Atlanta, Georgia. In the summer of '96, Jericho agreed to sign with WCW for $165,000 a year over 3 years. That deal included escalators that got him to $200,000 by year 3. But although he was now making 6 figures a year in his mid-20s, Jericho's creative wasn't quite steeped in the same level of riches. For about a year and a half that followed, he was little more than your bog-standard white meat babyface, entering to a melodious late 80s glam metal instrumental while flashing a Cheshire Cat grin. Despite having no discernible character direction, Jericho picked up gold in '97, winning the Cruiserweight title twice over the summer months. This time was Jericho's biggest break in the business so far, despite this mainstream Lionheart having all the character depth of a mud puddle. Despite regular TV time and several golden accolades, Jericho was unhappy in WCW and craved more. At one point, he did an interview with the then popular One Wrestling website, challenging WCW to give him something more substantial to work with as opposed to being just another gifted babyface in the crowd. As 1997 wound down, Jericho got a morsel of what he was looking for. After 16 months as a watered-down good guy, Jericho was finally going to turn heel. It began quite simply enough. Jericho would innocuously lose bouts on television and then throw a total core meltdown of a tantrum afterwards. This involved smashing chairs and even assaulting ring announcer Dave Penzer, ripping off his jacket during a fit of rage. Over the weeks ahead, Jericho would precede his matches by asking the fans to forgive him for his recent behavior, only to inevitably revert back to those outbursts after losing yet again. The demonstrative insincerity was the real hook to Jericho's not-so-subtle turn. By revealing his two-faced nature, Jericho now had a strong foundation to build his new character upon. Very quickly, at January 1998's sold-out pay-per-view, Jericho struck gold again, winning the Cruiserweight title for a 3rd time by defeating Rey Mysterio. But he didn't just beat the popular high flyer, he attacked his injured knee with a toolbox after the match, writing Mysterio out to have surgery. It wasn't just the heinous acts that cemented Jericho's star turn, it was all manner of creative accessories. There were the self-styled nicknames like the Paragon of Virtue, Your Role Model, and the timeless Ayatollah of Rock and Roller. There was also his physical presentation, from the exaggerated goatee and sideburns to the ludicrous top-knotted hairstyle. He personally redubbed the popular weekly wrestling program to be Monday Night Jericho and had the t-shirt to back up this rebrand. Jericho also began using a gnarly-looking Boston Crab that dangerously kinked the neck, which he dubbed the Lion Tamer. And of course, there would be his first big catchphrase, his multi-applicable claim that he, or someone else, or something would never, ever be the same again. But no matter how heelish Jericho acted, it was kind of hard to boo him, seeing as he was clearly having so much fun in this role, and his evident fun was infectious for the audience. And the call-out acts continued. He defeated Juventud Guerrera at Super Brawl, forcing Juvi to have to remove his sacred mask. He so thoroughly dismantled Dean Malenko both physically and mentally that after defeating the Man of 1000 Holds at Marches Uncensored, the usually stoic Malenko vaguely declared that he was going home, indicating that Jericho had truly broken his will. And Jericho, well, he laughed it all up at the expense of his vanquished foes. He sometimes donned Juvi's mask and also famously proclaimed himself to be the Man of 1004 Holds to get 4 up on Dean Malenko. Mind you, if Jericho got any promo time even just 6 months before this period, it would have amounted to little more than toothless babyface spirit. But heel Jericho was an absolute revelation for 1998 pro wrestling. While Jericho cycled through his offbeat brand of nonsense week after week, he taunted the absent Malenko, breadcrumbing the fans into wanting to see Dean return and shut Jericho's mouth for good. In what might be the high point for WCW's Cruiserweight division from a creative standpoint, Jericho presided over a Cruiserweight Battle Royal at May's Slamboree pay-per-view, in which the winner would immediately then face him for the title. Jericho continued to affirm his value on the mic by giving snarky and condescending ring intros for all of the entrants, most of which were genuinely hilarious. But the biggest laugh would be at Jericho's expense once the Battle Royal ended. The match came down to Juvi and a masked lower mid-carder named Cyclope. To everyone's confusion, Juvi voluntarily eliminated himself, leading to Cyclope unmasking as the returning Dean Malenko. The crowd in Worcester, Massachusetts came unglued as Malenko proceeded to beat the crap out of a no longer laughing Jericho and then submit him to the Texas Cloverleaf to win the Cruiserweight title. While Jericho had proven to be both a gifted in-ring wrestler and an extroverted personality, his real value was knowing how to harness those assets in high-profile feuds. If he could do that in a mid-card feud with Dean Malenko, imagine what Jericho could do with an established headliner. And one such headliner reached a career milestone in July of 1998, less than 1 year after his debut. While Jericho was a revelation on one level, Goldberg was a certified phenomenon for WCW. His merciless streak of high-impact squash victories was the talk of the wrestling world, and the fans caught on to Goldberg's understated coolness. And when he crushed Hollywood Hulk Hogan to win the world title at the Georgia Dome, 41,000 fans in Goldberg's native Atlanta were whipped into a total frenzy. In the still neck-and-neck Monday Night Wars, Goldberg was WCW's most valuable weapon. Undefeated and seemingly unbeatable, keeping the domineering champion strong was crucial to the company's continued success. Enter Chris Jericho. That September, Jericho, by now the TV champion, arrived at the annual Fall Brawl where he learned that he was suddenly booked on the card. World champion Goldberg was absent from the event, but a diminutive Goldberg lookalike was on hand for Jericho to squash in a hastened farce of a title versus title match. The segment was apparently originally booked as just a throwaway, just a little cheap heat segment for Jericho to rile up the crowd with. But inadvertently, this segment would actually be the beginning of the end for Jericho in WCW. The following day at Nitro, Jericho claimed that an irritated Goldberg, the real Goldberg, confronted him about the comedy segment. The world champion expressed that he didn't do comedy and told Jericho that he hoped it was worth it. Jericho was confused because, for one thing, this segment was apparently not even his idea. For another, beating up an undersized Goldberg impersonator wasn't going to kill the real Goldberg's mojo. If anything, it would just make the fans want to see the real Goldberg throttle the heel that's been mocking him. Jericho believed that the relatively inexperienced green-to-the-business Goldberg was making way too much out of what was just a throwaway segment. But it didn't remain a throwaway segment. WCW decided to continue this angle by having Jericho call Goldberg out on upcoming TV shows, building his own farcical streak of victories every time that his silly challenges went unanswered. In parodying Goldberg's entrance one night, Jericho assembled his own security detail, which unwittingly introduced the wrestling world to the immortal Ralphus, head of Jericho Personal Security. While the payoff seemed pretty obvious to any decent wrestling booker, Goldberg flattening Jericho like a steamroller, Goldberg was apparently still skittish about being involved in a so-called comedy angle. Still, Jericho had every intention of putting Goldberg over in grand fashion to blow off the weeks of taunting. Then came the Nitro of November 9th, 1998. That night, Eric Bischoff informed Jericho that he was putting over Goldberg there and then in a cold, unadvertised match. Jericho protested that it made no sense to randomly give away the match as it would squander all the time and energy that had gone into building interest. In a meeting with Bischoff, Goldberg, and Hogan that day, Jericho laid out his case for why they should have the blow-off at World War III 13 nights later. There, Goldberg could all but beat Jericho to death in mere minutes. Jericho didn't care about losing. He wanted to put Goldberg over. He just also wanted to demonstrate his his own value while making the result more meaningful. Jericho remembers that Bischoff and Hogan were intrigued by the World War III pitch, but Goldberg was still hesitant about the comedy stuff, even adding that he was supposed to have the next pay-per-view off. Still, that night on Nitro, the angle continued. It wasn't blown off that night. World Champion Goldberg flattened Jericho with a devastating spear, and this big blow-off match was still in the works, and it was looking like it was going to be quite glorious. A week later, Jericho showed up to Nitro to learn that his feud with Goldberg had been completely dropped, and he was now pivoting into a brief rivalry with unsung mid-carder Bobby Duncombe Jr. Upon learning of this total change in plans, Jericho decided that he was going to leave WCW at the expiration of his contract. All of that work had been for nothing. What began as throwaway filler turned into a feud with actual steam behind it, and would have ended with Jericho putting the babyface star over strong. Instead, it was just dropped due to politics and pettiness, and an inability to see the bigger picture. As Jericho later wrote, if they didn't see this feud as a draw, then nothing I would ever do in future would be either. And so, at just the age of 28, Jericho pondered the big jump. While Jericho had agreed to terms on a new multi-year deal with WCW, he never officially signed it. Jericho claims that if he had been asked to sign the contract before the Goldberg angle was scrapped, he would have done. But the story with Goldberg getting killed off also killed off any interest he had in staying with the promotion. Sometime shortly after, Jericho reached out to WWF head writer Vince Russo, who made arrangements for Jericho to meet in Connecticut with Vince McMahon himself. The meeting was at Vince's spacious home on a day when Vince was also meeting with Russo, Ed Ferrara, Jim Ross, and Bruce Pritchard to put together forthcoming television and storylines. Jericho even sat in on the meeting and was even asked his opinion on different creative elements of those proposed plans. Now, this wasn't just dumb luck, this was a calculated move on Vince's part. As Jericho had already vented some of his frustrations to Vince about all of the red tape and the sheer apathy within WCW's hierarchy, Vince instead went the opposite way. He made Jericho feel valued and included during that brief meeting at his home. Sometime after the meeting, Jericho informed Bischoff that he wasn't going to sign his new WCW deal. He played out the rest of it in a feud with Perry Saturn in early '99 before having his last televised match on the April 5th Nitro. 2 weeks later, Vince McMahon formally called Jericho at home asking if he was going to make the jump. That summer, Jericho and the WWF finalized a 3-year deal with a downside of $450,000 a year. With Jericho's name and his impending exit all over the internet rumor mill, WCW, who was by now getting thrashed by WWF in the Monday Night Wars, had made a last-ditch effort to re-sign Jericho. They apparently even offered him more money than the WWF was going to, but Jericho still opted to leave, as all the BS that he'd experienced in WCW paled mightily to the WWF's open-armed offer. On July 21st, Jericho wrestled his final WCW match, a 25-minute encounter at a house show in Peoria, Illinois. Afterwards, Jericho had an untelevised curtain call with some of his closest friends in the industry, and then the countdown was on, literally. The WWF displayed a Millennium countdown clock in cold, unacknowledged vignettes, though the elapsing time actually ticked towards 10:25 p.m. on Monday night, August 9th. On Raw that evening in Chicago, those precious final seconds disrupted an in-ring promo by The Rock. When the name Jericho flashed on the Titantron, the All-State Arena came completely unglued. Fans had long been anticipating that Jericho was going to be the Millennium reveal, but seeing it with their own eyes was truly believing it. With those cheers, Jericho, his arms outstretched on the stage in that now famous pose, just knew he'd made the right decision. From day one, the WWF treated Chris Jericho as an absolute star. This jump proved to be the genesis of one of pro wrestling's most storied runs, a run which is arguably still going on today. From there, Jericho headlined pay-per-views, won world titles, feuded with any and every conceivable top star, and made himself a living legend. His longevity is extraordinarily rare in the wrestling business, as is his ability to successfully reinvent himself at different points, even into his 50s. However one feels about Chris Jericho, they cannot deny that he is one of very few active pro wrestlers to make such a sustained, long-term impact on the wrestling business, especially at such a premium level. Year in, year out, run after run after run after run, Jericho has been an important figure for 2 different major organizations since the summer of 1999. And he wanted, to be fair, to be just as important in WCW, but he was met with maddening resistance. One quietly scrapped storyline later, and one wrestler's destiny was changed forever. In the same year that Chris Jericho began his true breakout in American pro wrestling, he came to realize that he was in the wrong place to reach maximum ascent. When that no-brainer storyline was abruptly killed off for no good reason, Jericho realized that WCW, quite simply, wasn't Y2J compliant.